very much for coming. Let me explain something. If you had told me at the beginning of my life, or even when I was 20 or 30, that I would have been speaking to an audience in China, I would have thought you were mad. Somehow during my life, very powerful forces, starting very far apart, have drawn me to China. I don't believe in the concept of fate, so I want to explain what are the very powerful social forces in the world that have drawn to me to be in China. And some of the things that I've learned from China, and perhaps it may be interesting to people who are Chinese to understand how China looks to somebody who is not Chinese. And I want to explain this honour not merely in polite words. I want to say something very simple, that the fate not only of China, but the fate of the whole of humanity in the next years is going to be decided in China. As I'm going to talk very much about the relation of China and the world, I want to make one thing clear. China's national rejuvenation and the interests of humanity are not counterposed. It is by pursuing its own national rejuvenation that China can make the greatest contribution to humanity. And I want to say really this period is very decisive for the national rejuvenation of China and therefore for the fate of humanity, and I want to explain that. And I know China is a very polite country. I am not a very polite person, so I say things which are true, not things which are to be polite. Right, I'm going to start off by quoting the words of somebody who I normally disagree with on nothing, which is Steve Bannon, the chief strategist previously of President Trump, who is a determined enemy of China. Normally we agree on very little, but on this I agree with him. Yeah, what Bannon said, I'll just quote him, "To me, the economic war with China is everything, and we have to be maniacally focused on that. If we continue to lose it, we're 5 years away, I think 10 years at the most, have hit in an inflection point from which we will never be able to recover." He's talking about the United States, of course. That is, I agree with the assessment. Neocons in the United States, if they do not succeed in stopping China's national rejuvenation in the next 5 to 10 years, it will be impossible to stop. This will be very bad for US neocons, and it'll be very good for China and humanity. I used a phrase which some people like in China, which is that China cannot be murdered, so it has to be persuaded to commit suicide. I mean by this something very precise. No force outside China anymore is powerful enough to stop China's rise and national rejuvenation, but there are people outside China who wish to disorientate China internally and make China commit suicide. Now you might think that's crazy. How can you persuade a country to commit suicide? But I have lived through it. The Soviet Union was never defeated from the outside. The Soviet Union was persuaded to commit suicide. And from 1992 to 2000 I lived in Russia, as I'll explain later, in which I saw the catastrophic economic, social, cultural consequences of having persuaded a country to commit suicide. And the thing I most do not want in my life is to see China make the same mistake. In his very first press conference as General Secretary of the CPC, Xi Jinping explained the relation of China and humanity. He said, "Throughout 5,000 years of development, the Chinese nation has made significant contributions to the progress of human civilization. Our responsibility is to pursue the goal of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation so that China can stand firmer and stronger among the world's nations and make new and greater contributions to humanity." These are very eloquent words. But you can also see them from another angle, of course, which I have to, which is because I'm not Chinese, but I am a member of humanity. So naturally someone who's not Chinese but a member of humanity sees the same thing from a slightly different angle. The great German philosopher Hegel explained that at a particular moment in time, the future of the whole of humanity is determined by the situation in one country. If we take, for example, the course of world history, the first anti-capitalist revolution, anti-feudal revolution in the world ever was in Holland in the 17th century, 16th, 17th century. Holland is a tiny country, but this event was so large that it influenced writers and thinkers for hundreds of years afterwards. Then in 1776, the United States created the first successful revolt against the British Empire and went on to create the most powerful state in the world. Then in 1789, the Great Revolution in France changed the entire face of Europe, and the fate of the whole of Europe was decided by the situation in France. Then in 1917, there was a great revolution in Russia, which had not merely great consequences throughout the world, but of course greatly affected China, because it led to the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, and therefore this enormous event in Russia was the decisive thing which was happening in the world at that time. And I want to explain very seriously that today, in the same way, the greatest step that can be taken not only for China but for humanity can only be taken by Chinese people on Chinese soil and in pursuing a Chinese dream. And I want to explain, I'm not saying this because I was in China. If I was in Britain, if I was in the United States, I was in France, I would say exactly the same. I just hope to prove to you that this is an objectively true statement. That's the general framework, but obviously I've got a more limited aim today because I'm an economist as well. So I want to explain why China's economic thinking is the most advanced economic thinking in the world. Again, I don't believe in serious matters that exaggeration is of any use at all. So I'm not going to say that China is the best in the world at everything. If you're a physicist, number one in the world is either a German Einstein or a Briton Newton. I am not claiming that China is the greatest country in the world at physics yet. But in economy, in geopolitics, and in foreign policy, China is the most advanced in the world. I'm not going to, because I know I'm talking to people, not economists, I'm not going to deal with technical questions of economics. I've written many articles on this. You can read a lot of them in Guangzhou and other places. Comparison of Deng Xiaoping and John Maynard Keynes. I'm not going to deal with technical questions of economics. I'm just going to prove why China's economic thinking is the most advanced in the world. I'm going to look at it, prove it, by the biggest tests of practice in the last 40 years. The very wise Chinese saying says, seek truth from facts. So we're going to look at facts. There have been three enormous tests of the development of the world economy during the last 40 years. The first is how fast do all economies grow, and in particular, how fast do developing economies grow? And by this test, the answer is simple. China's economy, as I will show in detail, has grown far more rapidly than the Western economies and the so-called Washington Consensus, etc. The second one that I was directly personally involved in was the comparative test of Western economic theory and Chinese economic theory within the former Soviet Union and in Russia. That is, if China's tremendous growth showed from the positive the superiority of China's economic ideas, the complete catastrophe created in Russia and the Soviet Union by Western economic ideas of shock therapy proved from the negative the correctness of China's economic ideas. And then since 2007, as everybody knows, the world has been in a very serious economic crisis since the international financial crisis, big economic problems. In this, China's growth has been much quicker than the growth of the Western and other economies. And there are no bigger tests in the last 40 years. In all of these three tests of facts, China's economic policies have been more successful than the economic policies put forward in the West. And this is why when I say that China's economic ideas are the most advanced in the world, it's not to be polite. It's proved by the facts. And I find it quite ridiculous that some people in China write that China should be copying the West when the West has been less successful than China during the last 40 years. This is really stupid. But I was also specifically asked by the organisers to speak about some of my personal experiences with China. So if you don't mind,
I will give you a few personal experiences with, and you'll find out from this what a surprise it was to find myself finishing up in China, because I never planned it. Okay, so first, how did I get into contact with China? Well, I think like most Westerners, my first contact with China was through food. Because as everybody knows, China's most successful export to the entire world is food. Every single country in the world likes Chinese food. Now, you must understand that when I was young, and I was born in 1947, I don't want to hide anything, Britain ate only British food. To eat foreign food was considered very strange. So when I was about 15 with my girlfriend and my wife, we discovered Chinese food and ate super sweet and sour chicken. We thought we were so sophisticated and clever. We were super sophisticated people. Now we have a problem because, you see, she's my wife now. We've changed a little bit in the photographs, right? Okay. So 46 years later, we can come to China. The problem is now we can't eat Chinese food in London because we found out the Chinese food we ate in London, now we come to China, is not really proper Chinese food. So this is a problem. Although it's true, there now begin to be some proper Chinese restaurants opening up in London, because you understand, most of the Chinese community in London originally came from Hong Kong 40 years ago. So they gradually adapted their food to Britain. Now my wife and I like to come very much on holidays in China. We have really good Chinese food here. My first intellectual contact with China wasn't through economics, it was through poetry. I have a great love of poetry. Unfortunately, I cannot read it in the original Chinese, but even in translation, when I read at university Chinese poetry, I was completely stunned by this. And in fact, one of my two favourite poems in any language is by Li Bai, which is known as, in my very bad pronunciation, Farewell to Meng Ha Ran, excuse Chinese pronunciation. So much so that when I went to Wuhan, I insisted to go and see the Yellow Crane Tower in Wuhan. I thought about for 40 years why this poetry made such a big impression upon me. And I couldn't work it out. It just made a big impact, and I couldn't think why. And then I realized it was because there is something very specific about the culture of China, which differs from the other great civilizations of the world. All the other great civilizations of the world, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, are founded on a religion. China is unique in that it is the only great civilization which is based on a system of social values, which is Confucianism, and not on a religion. And this, of course, gives to it a specific way of looking at the world. And this is why it made such a great impact, because it had a different way of looking at the world to European civilization. The next thing was, I read in 1969 Mao Zedong, in particular his essays on practice and on contradiction, which again made a great intellectual impression upon me. In particular, his insistence upon the need to find the main contradiction. And I may say that since 1969, every time I approach a problem, what I am trying to do is to find the main contradiction within the situation. But after 1969, for a period, I didn't follow China, and I began to follow it closely again with the economic reforms. So now we'll go on from what you might call personal engagement with China to some professional engagement with China, although I'm sure that the personal ones had some influence. The first thing I want to deal with, therefore, is the first test of the correctness of China's economic ideas, which is international economic growth after the economic reform from 1978 right up to the present day. First thing is, I want to say, of course, before 1978, China had great social achievements. One of the most interesting things when I was researching my book is I mainly knew about China after 1978, and I wanted to research very objectively what was the situation between 1949 and 1978, which was a period I didn't know very well, and which I wanted to study factually. Well, the data that I found absolutely astonished me, which was simply the social achievements of China between 1949 and 1976 or 1978 are the greatest in human history. I did not change my mind on the economy. It's true that the planned economy was quite successful when it was functioning properly, but it wasn't as fast as after 1978, and the economic setbacks in the Great Leap Forward and during the in the 1970s were as bad as is generally believed. So I didn't change my mind about that the Deng Xiaoping economic policy was correct at all, but I found the social achievements from 1949 to 1976 were incredible. In the 29-year period, life expectancy increased by 32 years. This is the fastest increase in life expectancy in any major country in the whole of human history. And I've studied periods of rapid growth, and it's well known to economists that life expectancy is the best single indicator of overall social conditions because it sums up all the good things, high income, education, healthcare, subtracts the bad things, poverty, bad education, poor healthcare, and turns them into a single number. So life expectancy is just the best single indicator of the well-being of human beings. In the 1970s, I studied the Soviet economy, which at that time was rather successful, but it made, in my opinion, two fundamental mistakes, which actually are contrary to what socialism means, because socialism means large-scale production. The Soviet Union cut itself off from the International Division of Labour, and it collectivised agriculture, whereas peasant agriculture is by nature individualised. So I concluded that it was wrong from a theoretical point of view. I don't want to exaggerate. This took up quite a small amount of my time, and I didn't think it was of any practical significance. But then, of course, in 1978, something enormous started to happen in the world, because Deng Xiaoping, Chen Yun, and other people launched the Chinese economic reform with two principal immediate goals, which was to open the economy to the outside world and to introduce the household responsibility system, that is to decollectivise agriculture. Now then it was obviously necessary for me to follow this carefully because there were two possibilities. One, according to the ideas I'd formed, this should be a big success, in which case it would prove it's right, or if it was a failure, then my ideas were wrong and I would have to change my ideas. So either way, I started to follow China much more closely. So by about 1981, it was clear it was a big success, so that solved that problem. So this was therefore looking at the first of these big three tests of the difference between Chinese and Western economic theory. So I'm just going to look very briefly at the facts of what then happened. China's economic growth since 1938 is the fastest growth of a major economy in the whole of human history. And again, I want to make a totally objective comparison of this. So I've taken China's growth since 1978-2016, which you can see is 5,700%. And then I've taken the fastest 38-year growth period in any in other major economies. So I'm taking their best period of growth in order to compare it to China. So you can see Taiwan province is 2,500%, South Korea is 2,100%, Singapore is 2,100%, Japan is 1,200%, and the US is 572%. And this is a fair comparison because I'm taking the fastest periods of growth of these economies. This means China's economic growth is twice as fast as any other major economy has achieved in the whole of human history. Now that single fact by itself is enough to establish that China's economic ideas are the most advanced in the world. But we can take some other facts to look at as well. Right, first is the question of the growth of consumption, that is of the material base of the living standards of the population. Now for some countries, unfortunately, you can't get data for their periods of growth on this, so what I've had to do here is take the most recent period. But you can see from 1978 to 2015, because 2015 is the latest internationally comparable data, China's increase in consumption is 1,600%. The next is India, 549%. So as you can see, the growth of consumption, that is the real material base of the living standard of the population, is almost 3 times as fast as any other country. Let's go on from average living standards to the question of poverty. Here, the figures are staggering. If you take the reduction in poverty by World Bank standards, which is an income of $1.90 a day, so I'm taking international criteria, China has lifted 853 million people out of poverty. All the capitalist countries put together have lifted only 222 million people out of poverty. And of course, the total population of the capitalist countries is much bigger than China. It includes India, the whole of Africa, the whole of Latin America. So China is just responsible for almost 4 times, well, more than 3 times as much lifting people out of poverty as the rest of the world put together. So therefore, I've again put this in numbers. China is responsible for 75% in the reduction of the number of people in the world living in poverty. And all the capitalist countries put together are only responsible for 22%. So why on earth would China want to copy the West when China has been much more successful than the West? So there I've taken the standard both of the total growth of the economy, the increase in consumption, which is the best indicator of the change in the average conditions of the population, and the elimination of poverty. By all of these criteria, China is by far the most successful country in the world. But perhaps to give an idea of the scale of this is, that indicates the percentage numbers, but China just represents much bigger part of the world than any other country which has ever undergone rapid economic growth. The first country in the world ever to undergo very rapid economic growth was Britain during the Industrial Revolution. At that time, Britain was about 2% of the world's population. When the United States, after the Civil War, began to grow very quickly, it was about 3.2% of the world's population. When the Soviet Union started to undergo very rapid growth after 1929, it was slightly over 8% of the world's population. You can see why the Soviet model at that time had such great impact, because it was almost 3 times as many people as in any other country which had industrialized rapidly. But when China started to grow rapidly after 1978, it was more than 22% of the world's population, or almost 3 times as big as any country which had previously undergone rapid economic growth. So not merely was China's growth more quick than any other country previously in human history, it affected far more people than any other country in human history. Okay, therefore, just to sum up again, whatever criteria you take, since 1978, China has demonstrated that its economic model grows faster and more with greater benefits to the population than any other country before in human history. Right, we'll now go on to the second key test in the 40 years. That is the test of China's economic reform versus the catastrophe of shock therapy, that is Western economic ideas in Russia. In 1985, Gorbachev became the president of the Soviet Union, and from the point of view of economic ideas, which I already outlined, he was doing everything wrong. He didn't open the economy to the outside world. He didn't decollectivise agriculture, but he started to move towards the privatisation of the state companies in Russia. If you like, China was an illustration of certain economic ideas from the positive, and Gorbachev was about to test them from the negative. So by this time I was spending a lot of time thinking about China and a lot of time thinking about Russia. And in 1992 I moved to Moscow with the aim of trying to persuade the Russian government not to adopt the Western economic theory, but to adopt Chinese economic reform. This is when I wrote from the viewpoint of theoretical economics, an article called "Why the Economic Reforms Succeeded in China and Will Fail in Russia and Eastern Europe." The argument of the article is obvious from the title. Now, it's necessary to explain at this time I still had no contact with China whatever. In fact, I didn't come to China until 2005, 13 years later. These articles was written purely from the point of view of theoretical economics. So if you understand, my understanding of China did not come initially from very specialized knowledge of China. It came from study of certain fundamental questions of economic theory. But these, of course, led me to become more and more interested in the question of China. So I went to Russia in 1992. This article created a very big impact because it was contrary to the view of 99% of Western economists who said that the shock therapy, which was what was advocated by Western economic reform, Western economic theory would be successful, and China's economic reform would be very unsuccessful. That was the view of 99% of Western economists. Now, this article had a very big impact. I mean, I had a public debate with the vice president of Russia. I had a public debate with the economic advisor to the president. The article was distributed to all members of the Russian parliament. Of course, in the end, I was unsuccessful. I didn't succeed in persuading them to adopt Chinese-style economic reform. Well, it was very difficult initially in Russia to get the material published, because I said the Western application of Western ideas in shock therapy will lead to a disaster. And they said, oh, we're not going to, this is very alarmist, we're not going to print things which may create alarm, etc., etc. Although eventually my material did get published, but it was quite difficult to get it published. Or perhaps I should say at the beginning of 1992, when the so-called reform started, it was quite difficult. By about the middle of 1992, it was getting quite easy to get the material published. Well, this is what happened on this graph. Russia and also Ukraine, after 1992, underwent the greatest disaster in a major economy since the Industrial Revolution. Between 1992 and 1998, the GDP of Russia fell by 39%. Between 1991 and 1998, the GDP of the Ukraine fell by 58%. So it was not an alarmism to say that these were going to be a disaster. They were literally a catastrophe. This was the practical test of Western economic ideas in Russia, or the ideas which the neoliberals in China want China to adopt. But they've been tested out once, and you can see the results. Now what we can do is, let's make the comparison to China. This is showing the whole period since 1991, that is the last period of the Soviet Union, up to 2016. In that period of time, China's economy grew by 948%. The Russian economy grew by only 21%. And the Ukrainian economy actually declined by 34%. So therefore you had the test in Russia, in practice, not in a theoretical debate. You had the test of the difference, of the superiority of China's economic ideas to Western economic ideas, tested in real life. One of the saddest experiences in my life was to see pensioners trying to sell single cigarettes on streets, people dying young, and the social decline in Russia was absolutely terrible. And the worst nightmare I could imagine would be to see such a thing in China. This is why I get so angry when I see the ideas that have been put forward in China by neoliberals, etc. Because I've seen with my own eyes what they do to a society. They destroy that society. And that sometimes people say I attack people with those ideas very strongly. Yes, I do attack them very strongly, because I've seen what it means in human terms. Right, in 2000, a client and also a personal friend of mine, Ken Livingstone, was elected Mayor of London, and he asked me to run London's economic policy. So that's what I did for the next 8 years. I came back from Moscow and I started to run London's economic policy. So at that time, I started to meet, of course, at long last, I started to meet people from China. Amongst the people who came and met with the Mayor of London, with whom I was meeting, I was in the meeting with Wang Xishan, who everybody knows, Han Zheng, they were at the time the Mayor of Beijing and the Mayor of Shanghai. So I got to meet senior officials, in the meetings with the Mayor, I got to meet senior officials from China. This was my first organised contact with China. Then for the first time ever, in 2005, I managed to come to China. So this country I've been studying for many, many years, for the first time I got here. And I began to get to know people in China. I worked with Li Yuchun, who's a very famous person, of course, twice. And as I know it interests people in China, I should explain why I got into contact with them, why I like her very much. And I'll explain it both from a professional point of view and from a human point of view. We've had the idea in London that we would invite, each year we put Chinese New Year lights up to celebrate the Chinese New Year, that we would invite a famous person from China to come and switch them on. I was in charge of marketing in London, so this was a quite simple idea. Now, you must understand some things about China are extremely famous in the West. Everybody knows about the Great Wall of China, everybody knows about the Forbidden City. So these are very, very famous, but they have a common feature. They're very old. So therefore, as simple marketing, my instructions to the public relations company was, I want you to find me the most modern thing that you can about China, so that we counterbalance the old China with the new China. And so they brought me a list of things that were very modern about China, and Li Yuchun looked most modern, so I suggested that she should be invited to come and switch on the lights. But second, I knew it related to an international movement of women, because modern women, quite rightly, don't want to be defined in terms of men. They want to define what they like, and they will do what they want for themselves, not for what men want. So therefore, there is a style which appears in many countries, which is that they dress in very specific ways. I mean, in Britain at one time, there was a craze that women would wear army boots, because they thought that they didn't want the caricature of always wearing high heels, so they put army boots, because they were the most different shoes you could have, just to show that they were going to decide what they were going to wear. And I could see in the way that she projected herself that she was projecting some of the ideas in a specifically Chinese way, but the way that women should define their own place in the world and not be defined in terms of men. And so, as she was both Chinese and international and modern, I thought she was the suitable person. And she came to London and she did a superbly professional job. But my heart opened to her for an episode in China. We came back to China to do a show with a very famous group, Girls Aloud, which is a very famous British pop group. And we were all up on a roof where the photographs were being taken, and we had to go back down in the elevator. And the alarm bell started to ring in the elevator, which said there are too many people in the elevator and somebody's got to get out. And Li Yuchun was standing near the door, and she just got out. And she didn't think about it or anything. And I thought, I can't speak Chinese, but I can see into this person's soul. There was no, I am a very important person, somebody else should get out of the lift. It's just, I'm near the door, so I'll get out of the lift. So from that moment, I've been a great fan of hers, not merely professionally, which I was before, but also I'm a great personal fan of hers. Right, so we'll go on to the third test of the correctness of China's economic ideas. This is the period since the international financial crisis. Obviously, in 2008, the international financial crisis broke out. In 2008, Ken Livingstone ceased to be mayor of London, and I was invited to come and lecture in China. So a lot of things came together at the same time. And in 2013, I was, since then I've become senior fellow at Chonyang Institute for Financial Studies in Renmin University. And this, for me, is an absolutely wonderful experience, because it shows that theory actually works in another sense. Obviously, from the point, because I've been writing about China's economy for 25 years, by Western standards, I know a lot about China's economy. But I'll say straight away, there are a lot of Chinese economists who know more about China's domestic economy than I do. So, how can a foreigner be useful to China? I think there are two areas. One is knowledge of the relation of China and the international economy, because as I explained, my original field of speciality is the international economy, and I know China's relations with the global economy very well. And the second is in questions of pure economic theory, which is what my original contact with China. It was considering very abstract economic questions of the division of labour, of the role of investment and consumption in the economy, and other questions of pure economic theory, which don't have a single language. They don't recognise national borders, they don't have a single language, and therefore a foreigner can contribute to this discussion in China. One of the things that Chonyang did was to help me was to give me the time to write this book. Now I can perhaps give you some little insight into writing this book, that I'm not merely being polite about Wang Wen, who's in the Dean. Executive Dean. As I say to the staff at Chanyang, I love him and I hate him. Because I'll explain. This is the interaction between a foreign economist and the Chinese colleagues I'm going to explain to you. It took me 3 months to write the economic chapters of the book, which is everything except the first chapter and the last chapter. About 3 months to write about 180,000 Chinese characters. I wrote them in English, of course. Okay, so Wang Wen said, okay, fine, the economics is very good. We will publish the book as it stands, but I think you can draw more conclusions out of this book. You can write also some conclusions about the geopolitical positions of China and what is your perception of China's understanding of the world. You work in China. Now, if I wrote 180,000 characters in 3 months, to write the first chapter and the last chapter, which was what was agreed, took me a year to write 40,000 Chinese characters. Now, it made the book a much better book, but it was very, very difficult because I'll explain why. It was to try to imagine a little bit how the process, how people in China perceived the world. And this was much, much more difficult than to write the economics. Now, I wrote only about 50 words a day often on this. And there are really 2 books. And some of my friends don't read the economics chapters. They only read the first chapter and the last chapter. And I've written a lot of these articles, a lot of the ideas were developed in Guangzhou because it was quite good. So this is why I love him and I hate him. I love him because he made the book much better by asking me such challenging questions, and I hate him because it was such hard work to do it for a whole year. But that's what you want. You want the interaction between people who are in China and international people, and it will produce some ideas that were not for either of them originally. Now, one of the delights that I have in China, of course, now is that it's possible to have social media. I write on Weibo. I'm quite pleased. I started off with 4 followers on Weibo, and now I've got quite a lot. And I read really an enormous number of the comments that people write because I learn so much from what they say. And I can promise people that when an article is published in Guangzhou, I read every single comment that is written on my articles because I'm interested to see what people think, and I learn so many things from them. So therefore, really, Chanyang does work in the way that theory says it should. I get an enormous amount out of it. My Chinese colleagues say that they get a lot out of it, and we produce something which some people seem to be interested in. Right, so let's go on to the third test of the correctness of China's economic ideas. That is the events in the world since the international financial crisis. Here I've done 2 things. I've taken the economic growth from the international financial crisis start up to 2016. That is facts. We know which are facts. And then I've taken the projections, which are made not by me, but made by the International Monetary Fund, which cannot be accused of being a pro-China organisation. So as you can see, from 2007 to 2016, China's economy grew by 106%, and the G7 economies grew by 9%. Again, this shows the superiority of China's economic ideas. China's economy grew 10 times as much as the G7 economies during this period. And if you take the projection to 2022, the IMF projects that China's economy will have grown by almost 200%, and the Western economies will have grown by 20%. So it's very strange when people in China say that China should copy the West. It seems the facts show that it's much more important for the West to copy China. Now, I also want to draw attention, however, to a feature of the present situation, which I think is not quite yet well understood enough in China. It's often said that the international financial crisis is the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression. Well, in one sense, this is correct, because it is true that after 1929, the fall in production was much worse in the advanced countries than it was after 2017. The fall was about 18% compared to about 4%. So the decline was worse after 1929. But what's not generally realised is that the recovery is much more slow. after 2007 and after 1929. By the end of this year, 10 years after the international financial crisis, the G7 economies will have grown by less than after 1929. So in a certain sense, the term the Great Recession is misleading, because recession suggests you go down and come up. The specific feature of this is it's much better called the Great Stagnation, or as Madame Lagarde calls it, the new mediocre. The feature of this situation is the extremely slow growth of the Western economies. This, I think, is a second feature of the new era. There's a lot of discussion of new era in China. There is a domestic aspect of the new era, which was focused upon at the 19th Congress. That is the transition, put it in economic terms, the transition of China to a high-income economy with the much greater demands for the population that comes from that. But there's a second international aspect to this new era, which is the extremely slow growth in the Western economies. If from 1978 to 2007, China was aided by relatively rapid growth in the Western economies, today it's a big problem for China, that China is going to have to make the transition to a high-income economy amidst very slow growth in the Western economies. So this is the third big test of the correctness of China's economic ideas, that it has come so much more successfully through the international financial crisis than the West. So for that reason, this is the title that I was asked to do the title of this talk, which is therefore for the West. I've created a website with the deliberate title of called Learning from China, because I believe it's more important in economics for the West to learn from China. So I've created a website to put the material on. And on this I put my material, mainly economics. I don't really write very much about my cultural impact with China. It doesn't deal with Chinese poetry, it doesn't deal with Chinese pop stars, so it's a bit boring. But it deals with economic matters, which is more important at the present time for a Western audience. Then what does all this mean objectively and personally? What I've hoped I've proved is that China's economic policies and China's economic ideas are the most advanced in the world. One of China's most important economists, Lin Yifu, has explained the general processes whereby the centre of world economic thinking is moving to China. I would have a slight difference of emphasis with him, because I think, although I agree very much with most of his ideas, I think in reality the centre of economic thinking has already passed to China. That's what the test of the last 40 years shows. It's not a question of theory, it's a question of testing against facts. The relation of China to the world, and also, if you might, my personal relation to China, can be expressed either intellectually or it can be expressed emotionally. So I'm going to quote two people. The first is the famous statement of that I already stated about by President Xi Jinping, which you all know, of the community of common destiny. This is a very correct idea that because of the interconnection of the world, humanity will either go forward together or humanity will go backwards together. But the fate of all nations and of all humanity is interconnected. And this is an intellectual statement that I totally agree with. But because in the end I'm English, and I'm going to express it in the words of one of my own country's greatest poets. John Donne, the poet, wrote very famously, "No man is an island, entire of himself. Every man is a piece of the continent. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." So these are very magnificent words written 400 years ago in England by a poet, but they express in the form of a poet the same words that are expressed by the President of China in a much more intellectual form. So therefore, because they're expressing the same idea, I wanted to explain that what I've hoped to show you from an intellectual point of view is what I said at the beginning, is not just to be polite, that the fate of China is the most important question which confronts not only China, which I don't need to explain to anybody in this room, but it is also the most important question for the whole of humanity. Because China has to deal with such extraordinarily important questions, China has been led to create and forced to create the most advanced ideas in the world in economics, the most advanced ideas in the world in foreign policy, the most advanced ideas in the world in geopolitics, because these are necessary for China's own national rejuvenation. But these ideas also, although they're not developed for the rest of the world, have a great impact and great significance for the rest of the world. And they've also had a decisive effect on my personal own life, which is not so important, but nevertheless is, I tried to explain, as I was asked to, in personal terms, what the impact of China was. So I've tried to do that. And thank you very much for listening.